A supply cart clipped the corner of Craig Hollister's jacket, and he stopped walking so abruptly that his junior partner walked straight into his back. "Watch where you're going." He spun around to find a woman in a pale green volunteer vest, crouching to retrieve a box of gauze pads that had tumbled off the lower shelf. She was somewhere in her late 30s, hair pulled back, no makeup, a laminated badge clipped to her lapel that read Hospital Volunteer in block letters. Around them, the corridor hummed with the ordinary chaos of a Thursday morning. Nurses with charts, orderlies wheeling patients, the sharp, clean smell of disinfectant cutting through everything. "I'm so sorry," the woman said, straightening up. "I didn't see you coming around the corner." "Obviously." Craig checked his sleeve. "No damage, but that wasn't really the point. This hallway is not your personal storage aisle. Do you understand that? People have places to be." She began stacking the fallen supplies back onto the cart without looking up. "I'll get out of your way in just a moment." A moment. He said it like it was the most absurd thing he'd heard all week. He glanced at Phil, his junior partner, who was studying the floor with great focus, then back at the woman. "Do you know what meeting I'm walking into right now? Do you have any idea what kind of deal is being decided up on the 4th floor in?" He checked his watch. 11 minutes? The woman set the last box on the cart and looked up at him. Her expression was entirely composed, not frightened, not particularly apologetic anymore either, just steady. The kind of steady that can look like nothing until you've seen it long enough to recognize what it is. "I don't," she said, "but I hope it goes well for you." Craig exhaled sharply through his nose. "Volunteer." He said the word the way some people say tourist. Do everyone a favor and keep that thing against the wall. Some of us are here on actual business. He turned and walked. Phil hurried behind him. Craig did not look back. The woman watched them go. Then she adjusted the cart, straightened the boxes, and pushed it quietly toward the storage room at the end of the hall. Her name was Sandra Vaux. She volunteered every Thursday morning between 7 and noon. She had been doing it for 6 years, every single week, with 2 exceptions. The week her business partner's father passed away, and the week she testified before a provincial committee in Ottawa. Other than that, Thursdays at Toronto General were non-negotiable. Nobody in the corridor knew her name. That was in many ways precisely the point. Craig did not think about her again. Not on the elevator ride up to the 4th floor, not while Phil reviewed the talking points on his tablet. Not when the elevator opened to the administrative wing, and the receptionist smiled and said someone would be right with them. He had cleared her from his mind as efficiently as he cleared everything that didn't serve the next hour of his life. That was a skill he'd been proud of since his first year in commercial real estate development, back when he was still hungry enough to notice it. He was no longer hungry, he was certain. There was a difference, and Craig had stopped being able to see it. The Hollister Group had spent 14 months building this proposal, a $340 million expansion of the hospital's northern wing. 3 new floors, a state-of-the-art oncology center, a rehabilitation facility, parking infrastructure, and a connected research pavilion that would carry a corporate naming partnership with 2 of Craig's anchor investors. It was the largest healthcare development project his firm had ever touched. It was also, he had told Phil on the drive over, the one that would define the Hollister Group's next decade. He was right about that, though not in the way he meant. The boardroom doors were glass. Craig could see the table through them, long and dark, surrounded by the kind of chairs that cost more than most people's first car. The hospital's board was already assembled. Harold Gentry, the board chair, silver-haired and measured, sat at the far end, the chief financial officer, the VP of infrastructure, legal counsel Craig had met twice before. And at the near end of the table, in a chair that should have been a junior seat, but somehow did not look junior at all, sat a woman Craig did not recognize. She was wearing a charcoal blazer over a dark blouse. Her hair was down now. She had a leather portfolio open in front of her, and she was making a small, precise note in the margin of something without looking up, the way a person writes when they are reading and thinking at the same time, and neither activity is slowing the other one down. Phil opened the boardroom door. Craig stepped through. Harold Gentry stood first. Then the rest of the table followed. Rising not in the performative way that people do when greeting a guest, but in the instinctive way that happens when someone in the room carries that particular kind of gravity that makes other people straighten up without meaning to. They were not rising for Craig. The woman at the near end of the table looked up from her portfolio. Craig Hollister stopped walking. It was the same woman, the volunteer with the supply cart and the green vest and the laminated badge, except none of that was anywhere on her now. What was on her was the kind of composure that doesn't come from a good morning, it comes from years, and the kind of stillness that Craig had spent his entire career trying to perform, but never quite managed. "Craig," Harold's voice was warm in a way that didn't entirely reach his eyes. Good of you to come. Before we get into the proposal, I'd like to introduce you to someone. This is Sandra Vaux, founding chair of the Vaux Foundation and primary donor to this hospital's capital development program. Craig's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The foundation's contribution represents 62% of the project's philanthropic funding base, Harold continued, with the careful cadence of a man who had prepared that sentence in advance. Which means that any major structural or partnership decision tied to the expansion requires foundation approval. Sandra's been involved in the architectural review since last spring. Sandra set her pen down. She folded her hands on top of the portfolio, the way you fold your hands when you want nothing about your body to communicate urgency. Because you're not urgent. Because you have time, and you know you have time. She looked at Craig with exactly the same expression she'd had in the corridor 40 minutes ago. We've met, she said. The room shifted, not in any sound anyone made, because no one made a sound, but in the way a room can shift when everyone in it understands something at the same time. Phil, standing half a step behind Craig, went very still. Mrs. Vaux, Craig's throat had done something he hadn't expected it to do. The corridor, I wasn't aware that you were part of this meeting. She said it without inflection, not finishing his sentence for him exactly. More like placing his sentence somewhere on the table where they could both look at it. Yes. No. Harold cleared his throat and gestured toward the chairs across the table from Sandra. Why don't we all sit down? Craig sat. He was not sure his legs had agreed to this in advance. Sandra reopened her portfolio, turned to a tabbed section, and looked not at Craig but at the room as a whole. The proposal itself is sound, she said. The construction timeline is reasonable. The oncology center specifications align with what the clinical teams have been requesting. On paper, the Hollister Group is a qualified partner for this project. Craig felt something unclench slightly in his chest. But before we move into the details, Sandra said, I'd like to raise something that I think the board should hear. The clench came back. She looked at him directly. Her voice was level and unhurried. The voice of someone who has learned that the quieter you speak in a room, the harder everyone listens. About 40 minutes ago, in the corridor outside the north stairwell, you knocked over a supply cart, spoke to the person managing it in a way I can only describe as demeaning, and told her to. Sandra glanced briefly at the board's chief operating officer, and I'm quoting directly here, do everyone a favor and keep that thing against the wall, because some of us are here on actual business. No one moved. The person you said that to, Sandra continued, was me. The silence in that room had weight to it. Craig had sat through a lot of silences in boardrooms over the years. The silence before a deal closes, the silence before one falls apart. This one was different. This one had witnesses. Mrs. Vaux, he started, I understand how that must have seemed, and I want to assure you that if I had known who you were. That's precisely what I'd like to talk about, Sandra said. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. The fact that you would need to know who I was. She let that sit for a moment. I've been volunteering at this hospital every Thursday morning for 6 years. I do it because my mother spent her last 11 weeks in this building and the staff here treated her with more dignity than I knew how to ask for at the time. I started the foundation 2 years after she passed, and I volunteer because it keeps me honest about what this place actually is and who it's actually for. She paused. It also, as it turns out, gives me a reasonably clear view of how people behave when they don't think it matters. Harold Gentry was looking at his hands. The CFO was looking at the middle distance. No one at the table was looking at Craig in the way that people look at you when they are with you. Craig became aware, in a way that arrived slowly and then all at once, that no one in this room had been with him since he walked in. I've worked with a lot of development partners over the years, Sandra said, turning her attention back to the portfolio. The difficult ones. Not the projects, the partners. They've almost always shown you who they are before the contract ever gets signed. Not in meetings, not in proposals. She turned a page. In corridors. This is about more than one incident, Harold said quietly. Craig looked at him. Harold was looking back with an expression that suggested he'd been waiting for the right moment to say what he was about to say. This isn't the first time we've received feedback about how your team conducts itself, Craig. The St. Clair project, the Queensway bid. There have been complaints. We've discussed it internally and haven't acted on them because the work was technically sound and the complaints were informal. He held Craig's gaze steadily. This morning is not informal. Craig's jaw tightened. Harold, I have spent 14 months on this proposal. My team has invested. I know what your team has invested, Harold said. And I mean that sincerely. The work is genuinely good. He looked at Craig with something that might have been regret, or might have been the professional cousin of regret. But this project will involve hundreds of staff: nurses, orderlies, technicians, volunteers, people whose jobs are already difficult. We cannot bring in a development partner who treats the people supporting this building as obstacles to step around. He glanced at Sandra. Particularly not this one. Sandra didn't look up from her portfolio. The foundation will continue its support of the expansion, she said. The project moves forward. But the Hollister Group's role as lead developer is something the board will need to revisit. I would suggest opening the partnership review to 2 or 3 other qualified firms. There are several who've expressed serious interest, and proceeding from there. She closed the portfolio. I'd also suggest, she added, almost as an afterthought, that whoever takes the lead on this project be introduced to the volunteer team on their first day on site. Not the board, the volunteers. She looked up for just a moment. They know this building better than anyone. 2 members of the hospital's security staff appeared at the boardroom door. They didn't say anything. They didn't need to. Craig Hollister stood from his chair. His legs did it on their own this time. Some survival mechanism that understood the situation even before his mind had fully caught up. He straightened his jacket. He looked around the table one last time. At the faces of people he had been certain this morning were about to become his best professional allies for the next decade. None of them met his eyes. He walked out of the boardroom. Phil followed him. Neither of them spoke on the elevator down, or in the lobby, or in the car back to the office. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse, and both of them knew it. In the elevator, Craig stared at the closed doors and thought about a woman crouching in a hospital corridor, stacking gauze pads back onto a cart, telling him she hoped his meeting went well. He thought about the tone in her voice when she said it. He had read it as the reflexive pleasantry of someone with nothing to offer. He had been wrong about that too. What happened next to Craig Hollister is its own complicated story, and it didn't resolve quickly or cleanly. It rarely does, when someone has spent long enough not seeing something that they've built a career on not seeing it. He lost the Toronto General project. He lost the 2 anchor investors, who heard through people who had been in that room. He kept the firm running for another 1.5 years on smaller contracts, and eventually brought in a managing partner named Teresa, who began doing something Craig had never made a habit of: asking people how things were actually going, and meaning it when she asked. Whether that was genuine change or the performance of it is something only Craig could answer. But it was a start, and starts have to count for something. The boardroom review brought in a development firm from Winnipeg. Smaller, less flashy, with a project manager who showed up on her first day and asked to meet the housekeeping staff and the food services team and the volunteers before she sat down with anyone on the clinical or administrative side. Harold Gentry mentioned this detail to Sandra the following month over coffee in the hospital's main atrium. And Sandra said that sounded exactly right. 7 months after the boardroom meeting, Sandra was finishing her Thursday shift, restocking the information desk, logging in the latest donation of reading material for the long-term waiting areas, when a man in his mid-30s came through the front doors and approached the reception counter, wearing the expression of someone who is not entirely sure they belong where they're standing. She recognized him immediately. Phil, the junior partner who had stood 1 step behind Craig in the corridor with his eyes on the floor. He didn't recognize her right away. He was looking at the volunteer coordinator's sign-in sheet, trying to figure out who to speak to. "Can I help you?" she asked. He looked up. And then something happened in his face. A slow recognition, and underneath it, something that looked very much like the particular kind of embarrassment that doesn't come from being caught doing something wrong, but from having to stand in the place where you once stood and said nothing. "I was hoping to ask about the volunteer program," he said. "I looked it up online, but I wanted to come in person." "What brought you to this one specifically?" Sandra asked. He was quiet for a moment, then, "I was here a few months ago, for a meeting." He looked at her again, and this time the recognition finished itself. His voice dropped slightly. "That was you, in the corridor." "It was," she said. I didn't say anything. The words came out flat without excuse or decoration. I just stood there. No. He looked at the floor. Not the studied floor study of a man avoiding a situation, more the actual consideration of someone deciding what the honest version of what they want to say truly is. "I thought about it for a long time after," he said. "What I should have done, what it would have taken to actually do it." He shook his head slightly. "I've been in a lot of rooms where I stayed quiet when I shouldn't have. I'm trying to figure out how to be a different kind of person in those rooms." Sandra looked at him for a long moment. "The coordinator's name is Margaret," she said. "She runs orientations on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. Thursdays tend to fill up fast. She picked up her clipboard. You'd want to call ahead. Okay. He nodded, started to turn away, then stopped. I'm sorry for that morning. I know they weren't my words, but silence is its own choice. Sandra thought about her mother. About the nurses who had come in on night shifts and spoken to her not as a room number but as a person. As someone whose comfort and dignity still mattered even at the very end. About the particular kind of decency that costs the person offering it nothing except the decision to offer it. Call Margaret, Sandra said. Tell her what shift you're hoping for. She'll sort you out. Phil left. Sandra watched him cross the atrium and push through the front doors and disappear into the gray November morning outside. Then she picked up her clipboard and went back to the work that needed doing. The atrium was filling up the way it always did by late morning. People arriving with flowers, with anxious faces, with small children who didn't fully understand why they were being told to keep their voices down. An orderly she'd gotten to know well over 3 years of Thursdays waved at her from across the room. A man in a waiting chair caught her eye and gave her the small, uncertain smile of someone who wasn't sure how long he'd been there or how much longer he'd have to be. She smiled back. She walked over. She asked if he needed anything. There was no portfolio in her hands, no agenda, no deal to close. Just the work, the quiet, persistent, unglamorous work of being present, somewhere that presence is the whole point. Some kinds of power make you loud. The kind Sandra Vaux had built, from grief and intention and 6 years of Thursday mornings, made her something harder to see and far more difficult to forget. The people who had underestimated her had all made the same mistake. They looked at what she was doing and assumed that, because it was simple, it must be small. They were wrong about that. They were always wrong about that. And the ones who eventually understood, not just as a lesson filed away too late, but as something they actually carried forward and changed themselves by. They all said the same thing afterward in different ways. That the room she walked into that Thursday morning was not the room that changed things. It was the corridor. If this story stayed with you, don't move on without leaving a trace. Give it a like and tell us in the comments what you would have done if you'd been standing there that morning. New stories go up every week here on Brave Souls Stories TV. Subscribe so you never miss the next one.